Hey everyone, and welcome to Module 12. We're continuing this week to look at economic issues. You may remember last week we were looking at neoliberalism, its origins in the context of the collapse of the Bretton Woods system and the gold standard, which was the Keynesian economic approach, or which were institutions all really of the Keynesian economic approach, are inspired by the Keynesian economic approach, which had lasted from the end of World War II up until the 1970s. And you remember some of the key events of the 1970s where the cost of the Vietnam War had brought the US off the gold standard. It could no longer back up the US dollar with the ounce of gold that it had committed to, and consequently then people did not believe that the system, the global trading system that existed up to that point in time, could remain stable. We also talked about some of the implications of that, the fact that from that time on it was believed that a free market approach to managing the world economy would be better. And we talked about some of the consequences of that approach in terms of creating disparity in wealth between the top and the bottom in the American economy over the subsequent 30 years or so. But we also talked about the implications of that on a global level in terms of the distribution of wealth, in terms of the impact of debt on countries in the third world. We also talked about some of the implications in terms of actual work practices as contracts have shifted away from being long-term contracts towards being short-term contracts. And I think that's something that's happened in the Western world, in America, in Ireland, for sure. I think it's also something that's happened in the third world in some ways. I think the advent of the modern corporation and the need for global supply chains has sort of been a development that's happened in a manner coinciding with the emergence of neoliberalism. But we wanted to set out last week some of the stakes of that flexibilization of labor and that feminization of labor, as our author was talking about, Spike Peterson, last week. So this week's chapter, the article is from Paul Kamek, and he's talking about neoliberalism a bit more. We had some mention of some of his key points last week, and I won't go over those again. These were especially his discussion of Thomas Frank's, this idea that there's a richistan in America. There's an America that's for the rich, and there's an America that's for the poor. And I think what I want to do is kind of, because Kamek's chapter is a little bit out of date insofar as it's pre-2008 and it doesn't really discuss the financial crisis. What I thought this week would be to try to make the theme this week about the financial crisis, and to have you guys watch this lecture today, and then in the next day, because we don't have class, you guys will be watching a movie that addresses the financial crisis and some of the issues arising from it and the complexities around its causes, right? Because it's not clear exactly what the causes of the financial crisis were, given that it was such a complex economic model that was being asserted by the governing powers. The question is, could they understand the economics and the finance aspect of what they were claiming they were able to regulate? Many people say that it's just the complexity of the financial markets today that makes them impossible to regulate. But, what do we feel as human beings trying to get by in our own way in a capitalist economy to do our part to make it all work, when at the higher levels of the economy there are such huge numbers being talked about and discussed that it beggars belief, and it's hard for ordinary people, to make sense of. So we're going to try to take an ordinary person's perspective on the complexity of the financial crisis in this class. So first of all, I just wanted to discuss something that didn't really come up last week because it didn't need to, I suppose. We were talking about flexibilization and sort of the real-world impact of the lived experience, if you will, of neoliberalism. But to try to formalize that, just some language really about classical international political economy and the different perspectives that you can have. And you probably already have one of these perspectives yourselves, but you may not necessarily call it that. but we just need to make sure we understand our terminology. And so these are just three basic theoretical positions that you can use to discuss the type of theory or belief system that you have in relation to the world economy. So let's just have a look at them now. One is mercantilism, and I suppose this is kind of a theory that suggests that it's a very old theory. First of all, it's probably one of the oldest economic theories around, right? Because it dates back to the time when market-based society was just beginning to emerge, and it was thought by the powers that be that the market could be a very useful thing for boosting the power of the nation state in an economic and in a military sense. So you have to try to think of this as kind of like a nation-first economic model. And this is where you would say, for example, in distinction to the kind of model that we have today, which is way more liberal, or neoliberal as we've been calling it, here you would, in mercantilism, you would try to produce all the different types of goods and services you need to at home in order to remain independent. Right? You don't want dependency on anyone else's country for your economic security. So this is, some people would say, very inefficient for this reason, because it doesn't allow you to specialize in what your natural competencies are. You have to try to do everything at home. So whether it's guns or butter, you're making it at home in your country. Liberalism, in distinction, is way more specialized. It says, why would we want to make butter when we make good guns, and somebody else can specialize in the production of butter, and then we can trade guns and butter with each other, right? Now, if you do what you're better at, you're going to do your productive activity in a more efficient manner. And with efficiency comes increasing returns in the market in terms of profit. So it stands to reason that liberalism has an advantage over mercantilism if and only if there is a sort of reciprocal behavior in terms of opening up one's market to each other from the other nation states. And so we call this globalization, which is where every nation state on the planet, or most of them anyway, open up their markets to each other and engage in what we call free trade. Free trade works very well for nations who don't have empires. If you have an empire, mercantilism is the best way forward, because you have access to all the raw materials you need, and you don't need to trade with anyone, and you can just have an internal market. But empires ended, it seems, or for the greater part anyway, empires seem to end. And so the answer seemed to be a more capitalistic type solution in the form of liberalism. Now, of course, it's very important here that you understand that when I'm using the word liberalism here in an IPE sense, or international political economy sense, that we're not talking about Glenn Beck liberalism. He uses that term in a very strange way. When he uses it, he's talking about basically, he's using it in a sort of a disparaging term to talk about hippies and people who believe in abortion and all this kind of stuff, right? And of course, those are liberal values, but those are domestic political liberal values, and perhaps domestic liberal economic values too, to a certain extent. But at the international level, liberalism is much more the sort of liberalism that was imagined by John Locke back in the early period of the Enlightenment. He was an early liberal scholar, and it's this idea basically that in the anarchic conditions of globalization, you can actually achieve a positive sum scenario where everyone wins. As John McCain said when he was debating Barack Obama in the 2008 election cycle, people talk about the zero-sum game of American economy, and he was disagreeing with that. He's like, it's not just that one side wins and the other side loses. Everyone wins when the American economy grows. He's talking about growing the pie. And if you can grow the pie, even the littlest slice of that pie grows relative to the rest of the pie, right? So it's this idea of a positive sum game where growth benefits everyone, and even poor countries can benefit in globalization because they specialize in what they specialize in, and get more profit on the global market for doing that. So liberalism has a positive sum approach to global trade based on a trust in reciprocal access to each other's markets. And then we have a third perspective, which sometimes is called developmentalism, or in its more robust formulation, it is called Marxism. And here we have a very interesting question, and we'll try to get a little bit of discussion about this today. It's a discussion basically starting off with, I suppose, what we'd call the snakes and ladders metaphor, right? So if liberalism believes that everyone has a fair crack at the whip in terms of the game of snakes and ladders, or as I believe Americans call it, chutes and ladders, um, Marxists ask the question and developmentalists ask the question, well, what if half of the countries are so, the northern half of the planet is getting to start the game of chutes and ladders halfway up the game, right? And then all the other countries have to start at the bottom. Isn't there more risk for the bottom countries, the countries starting at the bottom, that they will have to sort of accept that there's risk for them in starting the game lower on? It's harder. There's more, how should I say, possibilities of a disaster for you striking if you're the closer you are to the bottom. So to put that in human language, if I've murdered that a little bit, I apologize. Liberalism believes in a level playing field for everyone. So long as the nation states work hard, they can get ahead. Developmentalists say the playing field is not level, and they draw on some of the statistics and figures we discussed last week about global poverty to suggest that, in fact, especially for people at the bottom of the global economy, what Jeffrey Sachs calls the bottom billion, we discussed this last week, it's very hard for those countries to get ahead. One of the key things that the Marxists put forward is the idea that we in the developed world have an advantage, and we're going to discuss this later on in this lecture in the context of the theories of Immanuel Wallerstein, who you are actually reading this week in your supplemental texts, and his idea of the core periphery. And it's basically this idea, it's another way to say what we've just been saying, that there is a against the evidence that put forward by the liberals and people like John McCain in terms of this idea of growing the pie, that there's a genuine disadvantage for the people who are at the bottom billion of the global economy. Jeffrey Sachs makes the argument that the starting position of people at the bottom billion of the global economy is pretty bad, simple things at the bottom, simple disasters that would, that we in the core of the global economy bounce back from pretty easily. He argues that because a good sixth of the planet's population is at the very, very bottom, that they can't get a foot on the development ladder, right? So you can play snakes and ladders probably and get by and achieve in the game if you're anywhere else in the global economy. But if you're part of the bottom billion, you're really stuck. And we actually had a look at that, didn't we, in last week? We looked at the champagne glass. And so that's really the dominant metaphor for us here again, this idea of the global champagne glass and how all the wealth is concentrated at the top of the champagne glass, where all the champagne is, and then it narrows in and goes down into a very thin stem. And there's very little wealth at the bottom. And if there's very little wealth at the bottom, then there's very little possibility of getting ahead because you've no capital with which to invest. And no one will give you credit to make any investment either, simply because you already have a lot of debt and there's not much successful track record in your history for development. And we talked last week about some of the issues surrounding that with the petrodollar debt crisis that a lot of these poor countries found themselves in when interest rates went up with the fall of the Bretton Woods system in the 1970s. So what are the perspectives if we're asking about poverty and development? Let's just try to see if we can figure out what the different countries envision in terms of the growth prospects for poor countries. We have two different perspectives to set out here. We don't really discuss mercantilism here because mercantilism doesn't really engage in, shall we say, development politics, right? So it doesn't have much to say here. It's like, take care of yourself kind of thing. And not many people actually believe that these days. So we have two basic perspectives today that tend to gain a lot of momentum. One is the liberal perspective and the other is the developmentalist perspective. So liberals want strong growth. They believe that growth is the name of the game. And the way you get growth is by unleashing the creative forces within an economy. You let as John McCain would have put it, and it's interesting, right? In American politics, he'd be called a conservative, but from an international economics perspective, he'd be called a liberal. And that's why I'm discussing him here, because I want to sort of play on this term, right? That we need to understand what the term liberalism means here in a slightly different context. So, Mitt Romney, for example, he would believe that the way you develop a country is through the free market, which once you have the free market in place, there's lower taxes, and taxes are the main burden on job creators, the entrepreneurs. Once you have entrepreneur freedom in a country, then naturally the country will start to develop. So the real objectives are to eliminate obstacles to entrepreneurial behavior through the free market, through fighting corruption, I suppose, would be a very important thing, standardization of a lot of the market system, and above all, integration into the world economy. So if you're lost in this and you need to come back to something to remember what a liberal is, remember that liberals are all about the free market and integration into the world economy. And their main argument, of course, for the economy is that the economy can grow as a positive sum game. As we said, John McCain wants to grow the pie. And the role of the state here is minimal, but it is a role for the state. In fairness, it's the state. Sometimes we think that our liberals want to abolish the state completely. That's not true. The state does need to be there, but it needs to be there in a minimal way. It's there to facilitate the development of markets. Now, on the other hand, the developmentalists, they have a different point of view. Their objective is strong growth, but they believe in equality, so they want growth to happen in a manner where the goods are distributed fairly. That's one of their strong complaints, you see, about the way the world economy has been growing, that it's left behind about 1 billion people, and those people do not have a decent chance to get ahead. They often will ask us to play a mental game for a minute, where we would ask, okay, say we're a soul about to be born, and we don't know where we're going to be born. We don't know which quintile of the global economy we're going to be born into. But we have the choice of a system to be born into, right? So geographically, we don't know whether we're going to be born in America or Cambodia or Azerbaijan. But we can choose the type of market system and government system that we have in those countries. So you roll the dice in terms of the geography, but you're not rolling the dice in terms of the system. Would you choose an American system where you're much more likely to have all the benefits and services that will get you a successful education and a strong foothold in the global economy for yourself? Or would you choose a more socialistic system where you have not only a free market, but a strong government role that balances out the disadvantages of a free market system to do with turbulence in the marketplace and that kind of thing, with strong opportunities for education and for personal development? So which would you choose? Most people, it's clear, would choose the market system with the strong government as well, for the simple reason that being born into an American-style system outside of America makes it very, very difficult for people to get ahead. In fact, many people would say that that's the principal problem with the bottom billion right now, is that they are born into an American free market opportunity system, but because there's no foothold to get access to the marketplace, they're screwed. They remain stuck in a country that has a lot of debt and no money to provide any goods and services for the people who live there. So in that sense, you're kind of condemned before you even manage to get a start in your life, and in all likelihood you will be dead before you're 40 if you're part of the bottom billion, because lifespan is very, very short there. So it's pause for thought, and we discussed already last week how difficult it is for many people to get by in an American-style system, even here in the Western world. So the main defense here of this argument is that historically the rich Western states have achieved their successful positions, actually despite the myth of the free market. They achieved their success through strong government intervention in the industrial sector and through Keynesian economics, which have balanced out the rough edges of the market whenever the market got a little turbulent. And so it's not for thanks to free market economics that the Western world has thrived economically. And so there's an irony then if the Western world is going to turn around and say, well, we achieved our preeminent economic position through the free market, you can do it too. That's not actually historically true, is what the Marxists would say. The Marxists have always relied on it. The Western states have always relied on a strong state, a strong imperial state, actually, because part of the history of Western economic development is the history of imperialism, as we discussed last week, and we'll discuss again later in this lecture. So recall last week that we talked about the IMF and the World Bank. One of the things we want to discuss this week is how in the neoliberal age these Bretton Woods institutions have been functioning. Remember, they used to function on a more Keynesian economic model. So how are they functioning today? Well, the IMF and the World Bank were designed, of course, to help struggling countries. And with neoliberalism, the mission changed because there was not really the resources there anymore to help the countries exist as they had existed up to to help those institutions function in relation to those countries as they had functioned up to that point in time. And so a new type of policy had to be introduced in order to compensate for the fact that the resources weren't there anymore. The countries were going to have to do more to help themselves, but not only just help themselves, they were going to help themselves in a radically new free market global context. So a thing emerges based on the principles of neoliberalism called the Washington Consensus, which is whereby all the major power brokers and stakeholders in the global institutions like the IMF and the World Bank were going to put structural adjustment policies front and center in their efforts to alleviate the impoverished condition of many of these countries. They were going to try to get these countries growing out of poverty through free market systems, with the idea, as John McCain or as Mitt Romney might put it, taking the burden off the entrepreneurs. And so this is what we call the governance agenda. It was a key argument of the World Bank, even up to today, although I think that's starting to change. The goal of promoting entrepreneurship within poor countries would lead to a shift in global governance strategies towards enticing these countries to think about tax, welfare, and labor market reform in their domestic contexts. Now, that it is thought was going to be a recipe for success, and it was introduced basically starting in the 1970s through the 80s and into the 90s. However, and this is the tricky part of my argument, and we'll probably need to go into next week to make some of this argument, because I don't know that I'll have enough time today. But one of the things you do need to understand about the approach here is that it involves opening up the markets of these countries to global flows of goods and services. And there's two ways in which we need to speak about opening up markets. You can open up markets to literal goods and services. That's fine. In fact, many people who are even critical of globalization will say that there's a space for that. That global markets are not necessarily a bad thing. Global specialization and efficiency is not nearly a bad thing. So maybe we can put that on the shelf for a minute, because there's a second type of globalization that can happen, and that's the globalization of finance. So globalization of finance is an interesting phenomena insofar as, if you can imagine it, especially as we sort of see the global finance markets working today, there's almost like a separate world economy in the realm of finance. The numbers are so vast, the amount of cash and goods moving around in derivative accounts really has almost no bearing on what's going on in the real economy of productive goods and services, where people are making real things and providing real goods and services. So for the purpose of this class, we're kind of trying to imagine two separate economies. One is in real things and services, the other is in cash and derivatives and fancy sort of economic and financial accounts, whereby people are playing arbitrage with global currencies and that kind of thing. And when I say arbitrage, I mean buying long, selling short in order to take advantage of anticipated movement in global markets for currencies and for various other types of accounts that large corporations provide to global speculators and that kind of thing. And it's very complex, and I'm not going to pretend here to you to be an expert in this kind of thing. That's all for another person to teach you about. If you want to learn more about it, I suggest you take a good macroeconomics class. But the Washington Consensus, problematically, it is often said, didn't distinguish between these two types of economies very well. And so part of the story we're telling today and the next week is about the types of financial crises that have emerged since the 1970s with the shift away from Keynesian economics towards global neoliberalism, including our own financial crisis today. So let's start to talk about that. So, before we go any further, I think it's important to just check in with a point of view here that is going to be guiding us to a certain extent as we uh, look at the debate about globalization and about global economic power. So we've been talking just now about the institutions and the fact that after Bretton Woods collapsed, neoliberalism became the dominant paradigm of the day. And we've talked in other classes too about Francis Fukuyama and how he believed that the advent of globalization and the global free market was kind of a benefit for everyone as they realized the sort of end of history, as he called it. Now, 40 years beforehand, though, before the sort of emergence of this sort of ideological struggle between the West and the East, there was in Europe at that time, at the end of the war, a very different understanding of what World War II was about and what the future of the global economy might hold. Um, it might even be said that the 1970s and the emergence of neoliberalism and the fall of the Berlin Wall were, would have been seen by people at that time as terrible events in the sense of the foreclosing of a possibility of a global economy premised on justice and equality. And so, I mean, we should take seriously, I think, the fact that in Europe at the end of World War II, in Italy and in France, upwards on 40 to 50% of the population were voting for the socialist and communist parties. So when Americans think of World War II, they tend to think of it as a clash between the Western powers and the Germans, with the Soviets sort of playing a role on the side. But if you look at how Europeans perceived that war, many of them perceived it in a much more interesting way, perhaps for our current debate. They perceived it as a clash between the ideological forces of communism and fascism, where those two forces were seen to be, on the one hand, leading to the triumph of a sort of a statist ideology of racial supremacy, and on the other, a global communistic utopian promise. And it's interesting today that we sort of think of socialism as being sort of so state-centric and state-governed, but back then in Europe, people had a very different idea. They thought about communism as a global possibility. If you remember ever having read Marx's Communist Manifesto in one of the other classes you might be taking here at OUC, one of the things that comes out very clearly even from the first page of the Communist Manifesto is how Marx does not believe in one state alone going communist. He believes in the whole world going communist, in a global revolution at the same time. Lenin, who's in the picture here, also believed that, although he, in the end, with the advent of the Soviet Union, there was a tremendous compromise, I think, sort of struck there, where they realized they could only take the communist revolution so far, having started it in the Soviet Union, or in Russia, rather. And so, obviously, history takes a different turn than many of the communists would have anticipated. But the reality is that, and I guess why I'm showing you this slide in the next couple of slides is because I want to draw this contrast between how the world was imagined then as being kind of limitless, like we thought the economy was something man-made and something that we could master and change. And many people in Europe, having survived World War II, believed that that's what had to happen with the market, that it had to be made a tool of human affairs, a tool of human will, in order to achieve justice through this thing called a marketplace. Whereas today's market ideology, the neoliberals, as we've been saying, to me anyway, I think it's very, very clear that they believe that the market is a phenomena unto itself, that it has a scientific depth and reality to it, that it's not man-made, and that the best way for human beings to exist on the planet is to live in accordance with this sort of scientific reality of human behavior as it is reflected back to us in the shape of the market and the prices and all for the goods and services that circulate there. So I'm very taken by this contrast, and I wanted to start there as a way of segueing into the next slide, which is that we want to talk about Marx here, and Marx, of course, is a foundational figure insofar as he's the voice and the name that shapes a lot of the struggles that we were talking about, which of course accumulated for many in World War II and then the Cold War. There's a lot to say about Marx, and I apologize that this slide is very dense. But Marx does disagree, and I think this is, in a sense, this is a kind of a... I've said earlier on that many of the Marxists sort of form this third perspective with the developmentalists. And I'm not sure that I fully support that claim, because in fact Marxism, as I said then, is a slightly more extreme variation, or a slightly more, what was the word I used, robust formulation of developmentalism. And one of the puzzles set in the chapter that you're reading, of course, is why Marx and Jeffrey Sachs would disagree with each other about certain things. So we want to talk about that in just a moment. But for now, let's just talk about Marx and some of the things that Marx was putting forward as ideas in relation to how the global economy might function. I think, first of all, we want to start with the idea that Marx had a method called historical materialism. For Marxists, historical materialism is a way of looking at the evolution of history that puts labor and the struggle of working people in clash constantly with the pressure from on top of governing elites. And this is a model, an abstract model, if you will, of how human life exists in various historical modes. So Marx goes back all through human history, the long sweep of human history, whether it's the feudal era or the monarchical era, say, of the continental monarchists of the 18th century, 19th century, through to the advent of early capitalism, and then finally, sort of pointing at some potential tendencies that would happen in the future, understanding, as he did, of course, that he would be dead, but promising us that through these various struggles, these moments of history, there has been a certain dynamic towards progress. And at each and every struggle, at each and every point in that sort of working towards progress of human history, there is a sort of a class struggle dimension. And so this is his famous quote here at the bottom of the slide, that the history of all hitherto existing societies is the history of class struggles. And that's a very important quote. So let's look at these 5 key points of, and I think Kamek has useful supporting argument here for these 5 points. First of all, we talk about primitive or original accumulation. This is idea, if we use our snakes and ladders metaphor again, which we were talking about earlier. This is the idea that not everyone starts the game at the same level. Some countries are starting the game way further up the scale of value-added productivity, and those countries will have tremendous advantages over the other countries who still have, entering the game at the bottom, a sort of a non-level playing field to contend with. And imperialism is part of the history of that, of course. Now, another key point that Marx put forward was the idea that labor was exploited in capitalism. And we can see, of course, ramifications for how this would play out at the global level as well. So first of all, we have primitive accumulation setting up a kind of an initial division of the wealth, where some people have accumulated wealth and others don't. Now, how does that feed into exploitation of labor? Well, some people who have the wealth, of course, are going to set up factories, and they need labor to work in those factories. And what is labor? Labor is a class of people who have nothing of their own except their time to sell to the marketplace. And of course, the capitalists who run the industries, who run the factories, are only too happy to have that labor show up at the gates of the factory, willing to sell its time. And in fact, if anything, they're delighted, because what tends to happen is that more labor than is necessary turns up to sell hours of labor at the gates of the factory. And it's because the workers are willing to show up like that, having nothing else to sell but their time, that they will compete then for the price of that hour of time against each other to sell to the capitalist their labor for the cheapest price possible. And that is something that's very important for the capitalist, because he has to achieve something called profit. And he can't achieve profit if you think about it any other way. His land is generally at a fixed price. His capital, in other words, his physical plant, the machines, they're usually at a fixed price, available to him only at a fixed price. He can't negotiate with those prices. However, because he can negotiate with labor, that gives him a little wiggle room. And there's a difference then between the value of the good as it lands up on the marketplace and the value that he's paid off towards the laborer for their hour of labor. And so it's in that, Marx argues, that you find the kernel of how capitalism works as an exploitative phenomena. In fact, if you look closely at it, you see that the tragedy of labor is that it tends to exploit itself. There's only so many jobs to go around. There's always more people than there are jobs. And because of that structural reality, that unchangeable reality of capitalism, the workers will always have to fight each other for their access to the factory to get money. And that's the only way they know how to put bread on the table, because they've got nothing else to offer. They're not living on a farm. They're not living off in the countryside. They used to, of course, long ago, and back in the time of the feudal system, but they got kicked off the land then, and now they have to live in the cities as an army of surplus labor, waiting for a job all the time. So that's a second key point that the Marxists discuss. Then we also have the question of the profit motive. Now, the main priority of every firm in capitalism is profit. If a capitalist firm is not making profit, it's not surviving. It needs profit in order to be able to take a portion of the extra revenue above and beyond the costs of its initial investment in land, labor, and capital, and reinvest that into future development, research and development, for example, or inventing a new kind of product or refining product for down the road. So capitalism, part of capitalism is that it's very dependent on surplus derived from profit. A fourth point that Marx reminds us about capitalism is the constant revolution of production. Competitors are always trying to get one up over on each other. And so if you have a black car, Henry Ford, of course, made a Model T Ford car, and he thought that that was all the consumer needed for the longest time. But then along came the Japanese making cheap, fuel-efficient cars in all kinds of different colors and all different kinds of styles. And it really put pressure on the American auto manufacturer to respond. So this is what makes competition possible, right? And it's also the source of downwards pressure on prices. It's a source of tremendous innovation. And it's what ensures that we keep getting better products and goods and services down the road. So you can say that that's a good thing that Marx remarked about in capitalism. But it also meant that there's a negative side to that, that capitalists are always trying to find ways to bring the costs of the land, capital, and ultimately labor down. So any way that that can be achieved, whether it's through increasing the productivity of labor, because of course that's one way to get more out of labor, right? For the price that you pay for labor is to make it more productive. But the benefits of that extra productivity are generally not passed on to labor. As we often know, salaries have not been going up in America in real terms. For the average industrial wage has actually slackened off a little bit in real terms since the 70s. So that's why we say the middle class is collapsing in America, because of that pressure that the capitalists constantly have to find ways to avoid having to increase the salary that the laborers get on the markets. And then fifth point here is global competition in search of cheaper input cost capitalist global scale production. So global competition is very important. Back in the days of imperialism, the early capitalists could, of course, count on access to cheap goods and services from the hinterland or the periphery of the empire. But now that we don't have empires anymore, capitalists are very keen to make sure that they work with the global institutions, the Bretton Woods institutions we were talking about a moment ago, IMF, World Bank, to make sure that those institutions are introducing policies, are not introducing policies, rather at least, that would disadvantage them as they seek to gain access to cheap raw commodities overseas. Capitalists, as they say, have no flag, and what that means is they owe no loyalty to any nation. They're neither American, nor Irish, nor Australian, nor Afghani, and they want to make products the cheapest way possible and get them on the global marketplace in the cheapest way possible. So that's a very important part of our story as well. Now, that tendency within capitalism to pursue a global marketplace means that we have to contend with one of today's leading Marxist thinkers about globalization, and that's Immanuel Wallerstein, whose chapter that you have in your supplemental reader for this week is very important. And the argument there is very, very simple, really. that in the aftermath of imperialism, the nation states of the world have to pursue through non-overtly imperial means ways of achieving the same goal that they achieved through imperialism, namely access to cheap labor and cheap goods and services on the periphery in order to fuel the thing that keeps them in the position of advantage that they have in what Wallerstein calls the core of the global economy. So the global economy is not an even playing field from Wallerstein's point of view. It's not that everyone plays snakes and ladders or shoots and ladders from the beginning of the game. Instead, to the contrary, we have a game that emerges wherein people in the core are constantly seeking to maintain advantage from their neighbors by exploiting the position of preeminence that they have. With their advanced manufacturing, you see, they are able to make things like dishwashers, refrigerators, televisions. That advanced industry is something that's been built up and developed over a long period of time. Now, people in the third world and developing world, simply put, they don't have access to that kind of machinery. They don't have the capital to invest in it, and they don't have the creditworthiness to borrow the money to give them the potential to buy that stuff. Now, some countries have bucked this model, it should be said, over the years. The 1997 financial crisis in Southeast Asia, which we'll be talking about in the next module, is a key indicator here that, of course, countries in Southeast Asia were able to develop from the end of World War II through to the 1990s in a tremendous way. And of course, everyone knows today about the BRICS countries, BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa sometimes is thrown in there. So it's sometimes the BRIC countries, sometimes the BRICS countries. And those stories are very important because they suggest the possibility of what Wallerstein calls the semi-periphery, that is, countries that can develop because they have a foot on the ladder, they are able to gain some mobility and move up the ladder to achieve something that looks much more like a global standard of living. But still we find ourselves discussing the problem of the periphery, and Wallerstein has a very cynical outlook for them, basically suggesting that those countries will not have much of a chance in the global economy as time goes by. They will stay most likely mired in the muck and despair, if you will, of the global economy. So I'm going to end this lecture here now, and then when we meet each other again, we'll be talking about financial crises and the current financial crisis and the Asian financial crisis. I look forward to seeing you then. Take care.